Welcome to our final Back to Basics session. This session 3 is on tips for running your session. There's lots of sessions in there, but the idea of this session is that it will give you all the building blocks that you need for when you are physically in the room with your young people, all the things to be aware of, how you can pre-plan to make your session run as smoothly as possible. My name is Rachel Bunting. I'm the Bishop's Officer for Family Ministry for the Swansea Area Deanery here in Swansea and Brecon.
And my name's Claire Morgan. I'm Children, Youth and Families Officer for Greater Brecon.
And we'll be leading you through the session this evening. So our last session, if you were able to join us, was all about the administration essentials on what you need to run your session. If you didn't make it and it would be useful, then head over to our YouTube channel and you can catch up on that one. The link will be at the end of this presentation. So if you were here last time, then hopefully you've got to the point where you've planned your programme, you know what all your activities are going to be. Your volunteers are ready, you've got them all up to date with what paperwork they need, all of their forms and information is there waiting for them. Your risk assessments are done for your building and for your activities. You have your equipment ready to go. You know where everything is, who to contact in emergency, job done, you can carry on with your life. There is a lot of work to bring you up to the point of being ready to start your first session. And we really appreciate how much time and energy goes into just the preparation work before you even start with your young people. But your young people haven't seen any of that. We all know that it goes on in the background, but they haven't seen it. So the session on the ground is where the hard work really starts. And we want to make sure that you're feeling confident and able to do that as you go through.
So as Rachel said, it's really important to be prepared and organised. So before your session, you need to think about a number of things. You need to look at how you're setting up your activities and equipment. Make sure that everyone knows what they're meant to be doing throughout the session. Very often things will arise that that are unexpected. There could be a problem with the building, or there could be an issue with one of the volunteers or something else. So you need to deal with any issues as they arrive. Chat through these issues personally, whether or not you have seen these issues, or if you've had a bad day, if you've had something going wrong in work, something that's been worrying or affecting you in any way and has an impact on the children. Try to get in a calm state of mind really before the session. So it's very often good just to sort of stay calm, think about where you're going with the evening and focus really on the children and the activities that you're going to be doing. Praying is important. Always make the time to pray with your group together and before you even begin. It doesn't matter whether it's the same prayer every week, but consider lots of different ways to pray for yourselves, for the young people who are coming along to your groups, and for the families attached to those children and young people. Pray for your session and for the church that you're meeting in, and pray that God will use the time to meet with the young people.
So when you are first starting your session, even if you've been running for a long time, you may still be having new members coming. So it's really important to think, what is the first impression that you give of your meeting space? If you're meeting in an old church building, is the first thing people will encounter a heavy wooden church door that they can't see through and they can't see what's inside? That can be quite intimidating if you've never been inside a church building before, or even just your church building before. So just something simple like keeping your door open at arrival time can be really useful. It may be that in your setting it's not safe to keep your door open for the whole of the session, but if you can just do it for arrival when people are coming in, then that can make a really big difference and help people to first step through that door. Can you see leaders who are waiting to meet the young children's parents? Communication with parents is really important, but are you as welcoming to the child as you are to their parents? Sometimes it can be quite tempting to just talk to the parents, make sure that they know all the details about picking up and about forms and things, and forget that it's actually the child that's joining your group and not the parents. Obviously, a good relationship with parents is really important, but bear in mind it's the child that you're trying to welcome and the parents come along with that. Is your group chaotic or very orderly? A room of children sat waiting quietly isn't very welcoming. If you're a child, it doesn't look like you're going to have a fun time, but also a room full of people randomly running around with lots of screaming and shouting can be quite off-putting as well. So it's all about finding a balance in between, where children know that they can come in and be themselves, but that and that they have things that will be planned for them, but also that it's not just a chaotic time of running around where they don't know what they're going to be doing. Is the first thing that people see flustered leaders? Now, this is why that time before your session is really important. If your leaders haven't turned up with enough time to get everything prepped, or there's a lot going on in their lives, or they are overwhelmed by the number of children that are there, then they can come across as very flustered, not having the time to speak to the young people, and too worried about the activities that they're planning rather than the relationship with the children who are there. Start of a session, it can be very stressful. You go from that nice, peaceful time of calm before the doors open to suddenly potentially having a lot of young children coming in and running around. But just remember to take a deep breath, embrace it with joy and love for these young people, and try to come across as calmly as you can.
So register is really important for your group. It's probably a good idea to have one person in charge of the register every week. So you can try and make it a routine for your parents to sign their children in and out. That way you know who is there, when they've arrived and when they've left. You can always have a quick count up of the numbers of children that are there, so you've got the number in your head as well when you're working out different activities such as crafts and things like that. Make sure you've got enough for everyone. Also, if you have a new member joining your group, you don't really want to overwhelm them and have a queue at the door whilst people are trying to sign in. So the best thing to do would be to prepare a new member pack that a parent can take away with them, or you could send them via email or in the post in advance. Make sure though, on the evening or the daytime when the new child begins, that you have the appropriate information such as the name, date of birth and emergency contact names and telephone numbers, because you may need them even if they're only there for a short time. If you've reached your ratio for adults and children, you could also start a waiting list. If you've got a popular group, then you could just start a waiting list, making sure that you've got the child's contact name, age and parent contact details, so you can get in touch as soon as there's a space available.
Start of a session, as we said, it can be quite chaotic, and one of the reasons is that different people can arrive at different times. If your group starts at 7 o'clock, you can guarantee that some people will be there waiting at the door at 7, and you'll still have people loitering through at 15:15. If you're a group that is able to provide transport, then you may have a large number of children coming in at the same time, in which case that register system is a really important thing to have in place. But sometimes it can take 15 minutes to get everybody in and the session started. So it's a good idea to not plan activities for those first 15 minutes that you'll need the whole group to participate in. So it can be useful to have starter activities that can be done either individually or in small groups so that people can join in with those activities as they arrive. Starter activity could be something productive, such as a craft that introduces your theme, or a craft that they can be using later on in the session as part of the group. Or you could use the time for socialising. You could have an unscheduled time for members to get tuck or a drink, or to catch up with each other. Whether that's individually catching up with each other, if you have a group that goes to different schools or who may not have seen each other during the week, that can be a really nice time for young people. Or you could use it as a relationship building time with your leaders as well. So maybe having some time where you can join in, have a theme of what you're going to be having a chat about, and just leaders to check in with the kids, see how their day in school has been, make sure that everybody's happy, and have a nice, calm, gradual start to the session that doesn't involve everybody being there all at the same time.
Time management. Time management can be difficult. You may have planned lots of exciting activities and worked out how long everything is going to take for each activity. But when you get to the evening, things can change very quickly. For example, your craft could be finished in 5 minutes, instead of what you've anticipated would take 20 minutes, or you could have someone asking lots of questions during the talking time, and that could overrun and you may not want to interrupt and move on to another activity. So try and be flexible and be fluid. And if, you know, the best thing to do is just not to panic, and for you and the rest of your volunteers to be able to come up with different options throughout the group meeting. Sometimes you just need to prioritise the activities in a different way and move things around throughout the evening. But also the other good thing to do would be to have some games or activities that you could do, which you don't need anything, no props or anything to do these things. For example, a name game, if you're sat around in a circle, or if there's lots of tidying up to be done, if the craft has finished really quickly, then you could ask the children to get involved with tidy up time and different things like that. So it's just surprising how difficult it is to manage the time, but it's good to have a plan and then just work around things as best as you can.
This may seem very obvious statement, but remember that you are not a school. It can be very, very easy to revert to teacher-student relationships in a youth group setting, especially if either your leaders are teachers or if the only experience you've had of being in a group with other young people is at school. So it's really important to get the balance right. Bear in mind that the young people have chosen to come to your group, or children. They've already spent a lot of their time in school, and part of the reason that they come is to have fun. They do also come to learn and to experience new things, but they can do that in school as well. They've chosen to spend their free time coming to your group because they enjoy it. However, your volunteers are also giving up their time, especially if they are teachers and they've been in school all day. They're probably tired at the end of the day themselves. And it's very difficult if a leader has spent a long time planning an activity and you can't run it because the children aren't listening, so you run out of time, or you're not able to explain the rules of a game properly because people don't settle down. So there is a balance to be caught between having a certain amount of order so that you can do things, but not enforcing too much strictness and rigidity so that it does feel like they're back in school again. So have a think about what you can put in place in your group so that both your young people and your volunteers know when they need to listen and when they can run a bit more wild. For example, it could be that when you need people to sit down and listen to instructions, that you raise your hand, and all the people in your group know that when they raise your hand, it's time to settle down and be quiet so you can move on to the next thing. It could be that you set a code of conduct for when you're in a session, or you have some other sort of signal or phrase that you use so young people know, right, this is a time for us to settle down, and that over time they will learn that they're settling down so that they can start a new activity and do something else that's fun. It does take a little bit of time, particularly the younger the children, but it's really helpful to have a system in place so that you aren't stuck with a lot of children running around and no way of settling them down that doesn't involve shouting like they might have to listen to in school.
Even with a behaviour agreement, you might still find that there are issues. This may be due to something rolling over from school or home that can be disruptive to the rest of the group. In the first instance, just try and calmly find out what is wrong. Take the young person away from the main group to have a little bit of privacy and give them a chance to give their side of the story. Explain to them why the behaviour was a problem. Some children take longer to learn what is appropriate in different settings, so this can be very difficult. If more than one child is involved, you need to listen carefully to both and don't make any assumptions, especially if one's telling you one thing and the other one doesn't say anything or even disagrees.
It's also a bit of a sore point, but if you have children who are the children of the leaders in the group, it can be very difficult to get a balance of how they're treated, if that makes sense. So you don't want any kind of accusations of favoritism, that they're getting away with more behavior, with worse behavior than other children, but you also don't want those children to feel like they're being pushed aside in any way because they're the leader's children. So having open conversations with the whole group and making sure that it's clear that any children who are there with their parents are subject to the same rules as everybody else is really important, both for the other members of the group and for your own children who are there. It can be particularly difficult if the child that you have is a slightly different age group to the group that you're running, but it's something that is really worth putting in early on if that's something that affects your group. Sometimes, however, having a conversation with the young people doesn't solve the problem, and the issue can escalate either to an ongoing issue where it comes up week on week, or to a more serious level such as physical disagreements. So here's some ideas of things that you can do, but just bear in mind that this will depend hugely on the individual children that you have, the age group that you're dealing with, and any other particular issues or requirements around the young people themselves. This won't work for all young people, and it's really worth getting to know your young people so that you know what will work for them and the best way of communicating with young people individually. So the first instance, can you keep the young people away from each other? If you have a large group where you're splitting your young people up into different groups for activities, then it can be quite easy to just keep the young people who are having a disagreement in different groups away from each other. Is there any way of mediating between the groups with a conversation with an adult? If it's an issue that's arisen in school, or maybe outside just before they've come in, there may not have been a chance to try and sit both children down and have a conversation about what's been going on and what the problem is. So could you be that trusted adult who can sit down and try and get to the bottom of what is bothering both these children and try and find a way forward? If not, is there maybe a wider issue that a parent could help with? If this is something that is coming up regularly with the same children or a similar issue with different children, it might be the case that having a conversation with the parents as well can give you some new information on what you can put in place to support the child through whatever the problem is. If no middle ground can be reached and the argument continues going on, if it's affecting the children themselves or the wider group, is it a case that for this week, does one or both of the children involved need to be collected so that they can have some space away and come back again next week and try and find a solution ongoing? Sometimes you get to a point where things have been building up and up and up and up, and it just reaches a level that isn't going to calm down in the setting and the space that you have. So sometimes it can be helpful to just be removed from that setting for now, and we can come back to that and try and sort it out again for next week. Also, the fact that children know that being sent home is an option if really necessary can help with behaviour ongoing, because they don't want to miss out when they know that they could be still in the group. And again, if this is something that keeps coming up and up, is it worth having a conversation with the local school or with other groups that they're part of to see if there's a bigger problem that needs addressing? If you have a good relationship with the school, that is really helpful, because it means that it's easy to have a conversation between parents and the school in support of the child. If you don't necessarily have a particularly strong relationship with the school or with the parents, then it may be that's something that you can't necessarily put in place. But if you do have those good links, then do draw on them where it's appropriate with the permission of the parents to get involved. If there has been a more physical disagreement, if there's been fighting of any sort, then make sure that the parents know what's happened. You don't want to be sending kids home with injuries that are unexplained or unaccounted for. And make sure that the parents of both the parties know that there's been an issue, because it might be something they need to keep an eye on as the week goes on in school or outside of school.
Sometimes a leader can say or do something inappropriate, whether intentionally or not. You need to be prepared on how to address the situation if it arises. So if a young person reports a problem, make sure you listen to what they have to say and get the details very clear. Thank them and reassure them that the issue will be addressed. You don't want to reprimand a leader in front of a group or in front of other leaders. This can be unnecessarily humiliating. So take the leader to a private place to have a conversation about what happened. Refer to your leader's code of conduct. Explain why the action was inappropriate. It may be necessary for the leader to apologise to the young person or for you to inform their parents what happened. But in more serious cases, a safeguarding referral may need to be made or the leader asked to stay away for a period of time.
Young leaders can also be a very valuable addition to a group, both in terms of relating to your young people. They bridge that gap between your older leaders and the children. They can provide a very useful extra pair of hands. Again, especially if you have an older volunteer team and you're trying to do some more active games, volunteer leaders are really good at getting involved in those, and for their own personal development as well, particularly if you have young people who are interested in going into some sort of teaching or childcare industry. That experience can be really, really vital for them as they go forward. Aside from the leadership and teamwork skills that you can pick up by being part of the group. So although it's a really positive thing to have, there are some factors to consider. Firstly is to leave an age gap between the group, so the children and the young leader. Ideally, this works well as a gap of about a key stage. So for example, a student taking their GCSEs, so that's kind of 14 to 16, year 10 or 11, would be really good helping out with a group in key stage 2. So that's 8 to 11s, year 4, 5 and 6. It means you've got a gap of a few years in the middle so that they're not too close in age, and there's a more natural leadership role that can be developed there. You need to think very carefully about whether to allow young people to help in the same group that their sibling is in. This can work really well, particularly if there's a bigger age gap and the sibling could do with an extra pair of hands, or somebody who knows them very well who can help to involve them in certain activities. But it can also go the other way and end up with sibling bickering and bringing other issues into the group that don't need to be there. So that's going to depend massively on the young people that you know and the sibling dynamics. So just make sure you have a think about that. Maybe have a chat to their parents as well to work out if it will work out before you agree for that to happen. You also need to consider the ability of the young people. Don't expect them to do too much too soon. Leadership is a new role for a lot of people, and it doesn't necessarily come naturally. It takes a bit of learning and a bit of trial and error to build up the knowledge of how to talk to young people, how to lead things, how to run activities. Some of your older leaders who have been there a while can sometimes forget that it does take a bit of time to get used to that. Make sure that you don't leave a young person alone in charge of a group. It's fine if you have a leader who's sort of flitting between different groups. I can check in to make sure that everybody's okay, but don't send a group off with a young person completely by themselves. They will still need the oversight of an adult. With that in mind, just remember that anybody who's over 18 will need a DBS certificate. So if they are joining you as a new young leader, or they have been part of an older group and are transitioning to help with the younger group, they're still going to need a certificate to help out with your group. So don't expect the young people to do too much, but also don't expect too little of them. Make sure you give them opportunities. Don't just think, oh, it's a pair of hands, we can just get them making the tea every week and be done with it. If a young person has volunteered to help with you, then they want to learn how to help, and they'll probably have things that they enjoy doing, and skills and passions that they can share with the young people. So if you have a young 19-year-old who is mad on football coming to help you, then maybe give them the opportunity to lead some of the games rather than just sticking them with crafts all the time. If you have somebody coming who really loves painting, then get them involved in leading a painting activity. So make sure that you acknowledge the gifts and skills that these young people have already built up for themselves and see where you can fit them into your group, because it's a benefit to them and it's a benefit to your children as well, to make the most of all the gifts that your leaders have, whether you're young leaders or your older leaders.
As you come towards the end of your session, there are a few things to consider. You need to fill out your session record. Make sure you do your register and record any incidents, accidents or learning points before you forget. If something didn't work very well, then maybe you don't want to do that again. Or if something was really great or the children absolutely loved it, then you might want to consider running that activity again. If you run a number of groups on the same night, just make sure you've got enough time in between each group to close down and set back up again, and make sure that you're finishing off your session record for the first one before you move on to booking people in for the next one and doing the next register, because otherwise you could get mixed up and then you may not know who's actually left and with which parents, for example. Very often after a session, you'll need to replenish your supplies. You may need to buy some more biscuits or squash, or if you've used lots of your paper and craft materials, then maybe that's something you need to add to a list. If you've had an accident during the evening or someone's finger was bleeding, then you may need to replenish your first aid equipment. Make sure that's done before the next session so that you have everything that you should have in your first aid kit. The person who's responsible should know what they need and when it is needed by. So that's down to your volunteer roles again. Obviously, it's really important to communicate with your parents. Let parents know what you've been doing and perhaps what you'll be doing next time. Try and speak to individual parents, make a relationship with them, and answer any questions as they come up. If you've had any accidents or incidents, then that's obviously something to report to parents again. And send a reminder if you're going to be outside of a normal meeting space or if you're meeting at a different time the next week, so you're all prepared for the next session.
That means that after the session, you need to try not to leave as soon as the session is over. It may be the case that some weeks you've got something you need to move on to, and so you need to leave the rest of the team behind. But on the whole, volunteers should be there to make sure that everything is ready before you head off for the evening. It shouldn't be the norm that everyone rushes off as soon as possible. So a few things that I already mentioned, but just to reiterate, tidy up. Really important. Make sure that you leave the building as you found it, particularly if this is a shared space and you know that there's going to be somebody using it after you. Even better though, can you leave it tidier than you left it? That's always a sign of a good youth group, is that they leave their meeting space tidier and not a mess. It might be that you are asked to leave it in a particular way because there's a group coming in either straight after you or a little bit later on. So if you've been asked to set up the furniture in a particular way or leave something in a particular place, then make sure you do that. It's just a sign of respect to other groups that are using the space as well as you. Again, make sure any accident, incident or safeguarding forms are filled in as soon as possible before you forget the details. Ensure that the people who need to be kept informed about those forms are done, again, within 24 hours. And if any issues came up, then that means that you need to make a change to your risk assessment so that next week that incident doesn't happen again. Then make sure that that's been recorded and communicated with the rest of your team. Debriefing with your team is really important. Everybody would have had a different perspective of what's happened that evening. It might be that from the top, everything seemed absolutely fine, but then if you speak to maybe different section leaders, you might find that actually there were a few issues that you hadn't noticed because you were running around doing something else. So it's really important to speak to your other leaders and check with them how everyone else felt that it went. Did anything come up, however small or large, that needs to be fed back that maybe not everybody else had noticed? And is everybody okay? If you've had an incident during the session, it might be that this has cause some sort of emotional reaction with your volunteers. So it's always worth just checking in, are you okay? Are you going to be okay to go home? Did anything stress you out? Are you feeling upset about everything? The sooner these things are shared, the sooner you can put people's minds at ease and carry on with the rest of the evening. And as a leader, do you need to feed anything back to the volunteers? Was there anything that happened that you need to be letting them know about, either that they have done as volunteers or that the young people have done, and if changes that you need to make next time? It can be useful to have some conversations with your volunteers when the young people aren't there. So make sure there's always that time built in after your session to have these conversations with your leaders. As Claire's already mentioned, what do you need for next week? Does anything need to be restocked, or are you running any specific activities that need equipment different to what you would normally use? Are there any craft things that are a bit more out of the ordinary that somebody is going to need to source between this week and next week? Are there going to be any changes next time in your location or in the timing of your groups? If you have a trip somewhere or you're going out for the evening, it might be that you just remind leaders. For example, if the following week you're going to play some games in the park, then making sure leaders are reminded so they can wear appropriate shoes as a very simple example, can be really useful to do the week before. Finally, if you are in a group that takes photos to share with parents, this will need to have been sorted out on your photo consent forms in advance. If that's something that you do, then make sure you share these photos with parents as soon as possible, and then delete the photos from your device. Photos shouldn't be stored of young people. If you have consent to share them on particular platforms, then do that, but then don't hang on to those photos yourselves afterwards.
Most of the paperwork we recommend can be kept on file for reference. However, there are some documents that you'll need to have access to during the session. If you use a regular place for meetings, then you may have storage there and you could keep a file there. Or if you're bringing a box of things to use on the evening, then you could have a file within the box. Or if all of the volunteers have access to this information on online, then that could be done, but you need to work out what's going to be best for everyone, even in your absence. So one of the most important things is a list of emergency numbers, for example, the venue coordinator and who to contact if the leader doesn't arrive or there aren't enough volunteers for the appropriate ratios. Your register is really important because you're going to be recording which young people and leaders are present and who's picking them up or taking them home at the end of the event. The access to emergency contact numbers for your young people and details of any young people who have medical conditions or allergies that you may need to be aware of. Incident report forms, just in case anything happens that you need to record in an emergency. And also the join-in pack containing forms and information for any new members that may turn up on the evening.
Just a point to make about registers, is that we've talked about it for groups where the parents are leaving their young people, but I know that a lot of people will be running parent and toddler groups as well. And it can also be very useful to keep a register for your parent and toddler groups, although you don't need emergency contact information because they're already there. Keeping a track of what your numbers look like is useful if you are needing to apply for funding further down the line, so you can say what your how many people are attending your groups. It can be useful to have a sort of vague idea of who is there each week, so that if you don't see somebody for a certain amount of time, you can check in with them and make sure that they're okay. Just be aware of data protection, that you're only taking information that you have a reason to take. So for a parent and toddler group, it would be appropriate to take a parent's and child's first names, but you probably wouldn't need to take any further information from them because they're there with you. It's just to kind of keep a bit of a record of who's there. When we were in the middle of COVID and we had contact tracing, that was a different matter, but that's not a legal requirement anymore, so that's not a reason anymore to be taking those details. So we've mentioned a few of these forms and bits and pieces. So we've mentioned these again in previous sessions and shared this link before, but just as a reminder, here are the links to the policies, forms and advice pages that we've mentioned during these sessions. So all the forms that we've talked about, and hopefully all the forms that you should need to run your youth groups, can be found on the Diocesan website, and they are grouped according to the categories which aren't on the following slide, but they are forms for your volunteers, forms for the leader who is kind of responsible for running the session, and then forms for the young people that they might need to fill out during the course of your youth group running. So that's the Swansea and Brecon Diocesan website on the Children, Youth and Families page, the Church in Wales website on which has information on how to use the DBS service if that's not something you've done before. And then the safeguarding training from the Church in Wales as well is also a very important one to have in mind.
I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening, and we hope that you enjoyed the session. If you have any other topics that you'd like us to cover, then please email us kifo.swanbrec@cniw.org.uk. All of our sessions can be found on YouTube at the link here on this slide. But thank you very much for your time.
Just as a note, the link on the slide doesn't include the date on the last session. That was a typo. So feel free to stop that where it says date. Otherwise, that link will not work. If you do have any further questions or comments, or you'd like us to have a look at any further training, then send us an email at kifo.swanbrec@cnw.org.uk. You can find everything we've talked about on our website, and if you follow our deanery Facebook pages, then we will keep you up to date with any further training that we have, or events that are going on around the diocese. So all the links are there. So we hope you've enjoyed this session. You can find all of our sessions on YouTube, and we hope to see you again in the future.